Some time ago, Juliet, my assistant at the time, came to pick up some work from where we were then living in Clapham. And she parked outside the house. It was just after 8:30 when the traffic restrictions began. And she came in just to pick up the work. She can't have been in the house more than about 2 minutes. And when we came out, to our amazement, her car had already been clamped. And the guys were sitting there in their van, smirking. They were obviously on commission. They looked very pleased with themselves. And I just can't believe this. How can you have done this in 2 minutes? She's only been in the house for 2 minutes. And they kind of laugh mockingly. So that's what they all say. Now, I'd love to be able to stand here tonight and tell you, this is how I responded. At that moment, I was filled with God's love. And I smiled graciously at them. And I said to them, I understand you have a really difficult job. I really admire the work you do. And it's because of your work that the traffic in London keeps moving. And it must be a very difficult job. It must require great courage on your part. And you must come across very difficult people. But I respect you for what you do. And I love to be able to tell you that at that moment they looked at me and said, that is an amazing attitude. You know, quite different from everything we come across normally. I can see that there's something quite different about you. May I ask, what is it? And I'd love to be able to tell you at that moment, I said, well, I am a Christian. That is what makes the difference. And that they replied, oh, really, I'd love to find out more. And I said, well, there's an Alpha course starting next Wednesday. Sadly, that is not what happened. It's not even close to what happened. I don't know of any passage in the Bible that raises more questions than the one that we're looking at today. How do we respond when we're wronged? I mean, they weren't actually even in the wrong. They were actually in the right. But how do we respond when we are actually wronged? How do we respond when people waste our time? How do we respond when people are rude to us, or insulting, or abusive? How do we respond when people take our property, our possessions? They're stolen or damaged through a burglary or a car crash. Or we lose money through someone else's fraud, theft, or negligence. What on earth did Jesus mean when he said, do not resist an evil person? What does that mean? I mean, does it mean women should submit to rapists? Does it mean that children should not fight back when they're bullied in the playground? Does it mean that we should submit to being murdered without resistance? Does it mean that we should get rid of the police? Get rid of the law courts, the judges? Does it mean that there shouldn't be any prisons? Is this the charter for the thug, the bully, the fraudster? Does it mean that Christians should necessarily be pacifists? Should we not resist the Stalins, Hitler, Saddam Hussein, Mugabe? Is Jesus saying that the Old Testament law was wrong? Some have interpreted this totally literally. Martin Luther described the person he described as the crazy saint who read this passage and as a result let the lice nibble at him and refused to kill any of them, maintaining that he had to suffer and could not resist evil. Leo Tolstoy, the 19th century novelist, towards the end of his life, took this passage literally. He believed there should be no soldiers, no police, no magistrates, no law courts. He was opposed to any form of government. And then on the other hand, there are those who totally reject it. For example, the atheist journalist, Christopher Hitchens. He describes this teaching of Jesus as deranged, suicidal, immoral. He's following in the footsteps of the atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, notorious for his claim that God is dead, who again totally rejected this teaching. He contended that Jesus' words were proof of the fact that Christianity was for the weak and the cowardly. He regarded it as a slave morality where charity, humility, and obedience replaced competition, pride, and autonomy. His search for the Superman, perfected in both mental and physical strength and without moral scruples, was later taken up and adapted by Adolf Hitler. So, what is Jesus saying? Here's the first main point. Expect to encounter difficult people. Who are the difficult people? Sandy Miller used to quote the devil's Beatitudes. If the devil were to write the Beatitudes, they'd probably look something like this. Blessed are those Christians who wait to be asked and expect to be thanked. I can use them. Blessed are the touchy. With a bit of luck, they may stop going to church altogether. They're my missionaries. Blessed are those who are very religious and get on everyone's nerves. They're mine forever. Blessed are the troublemakers. They shall be called my children. Blessed are the gossipers. They are my secret agents. Blessed are the complainers. I'm all ears for them. Blessed are you when you hear this and think it's all about other people and not yourself. I've got you. And we can all be difficult at times. Certainly I can be the difficult person. And using the word here, difficult in the negative sense of the word. Jesus used the word evil. And he gives 4 examples. First of all, expect to encounter those who are rude, insulting, and even abusive. This is a loss of pride. He says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. According to Jewish rabbinic law, a backhanded slap, in other words, one on the right cheek, was twice as insulting as one with a flat of the hand on the left. Even today in the Middle East, a slap in the face is regarded as a particularly insulting assault, a gesture of extreme abuse, showing the greatest possible contempt. And of course, we all know that our pride can be hurt without physical violence. Then, secondly, expect to encounter those who persecute or even prosecute you. Loss of possessions. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, Jesus says, hand over your cloak as well. Losing a tunic, which was the inner garment, would not have been a desperate matter because even the poorest person would have had at least one tunic. A cloak was more valuable and essential. Most would have had only one and used it as a robe by day and a blanket by night. So Jesus is encouraging us not only to give up inessentials without opposition, but to add even that which we consider essential. Ravi Zacharias, the Christian evangelist, went to speak at a university in Indonesia, the University of Jakarta. And he met there one member of the staff who was a Christian from a Chinese background. And this man had been praying for years that the gospel would be preached in this university. And after Ravi had spoken, he told him about something that had happened to him 4 years earlier, when a famous anti-Christian lecturer had come to speak at this university in an auditorium of about 2,000 people. This man was the only Christian there. And this anti-Christian lecturer called him out as a staff member in front of all his students, and he said, you're a Christian, I want you to come up on stage. So he came forward and he stood in front of him, and then he slapped him around the face really hard. And then he said, I'm waiting. What does your Jesus tell you to do? So our friend did what Jesus told him to do, and he turned the other cheek, and the lecturer slapped him across the head again. And this is a shame culture where this was the teacher of many of those students, and they were totally shocked. The lecturer then went on to say, look at the weakness of Christians. Christianity is founded on weakness. Then he said, give me your coat. So the man took off his coat and handed it over. He said, I'm waiting. What does your Jesus tell you to do now? So there's our Christian friend standing in an audience of thousands, many of them his students. And he said, I just want to say to all of you who are my students, I don't want you to be embarrassed because of me. So you may want to close your eyes at this moment. And then he took off his clothes and gave them to the man. And he walked out, tears pouring down his face, humiliated. Amazing thing happened the next day. One after another of his students came into his study, and they said this, we're so ashamed about what happened yesterday. Can you tell us more about your Jesus? What we saw in you was something beautiful. Can you explain it to us? He received letters and opportunities to share the gospel with hundreds of students that he never had before. Thirdly, Jesus says, expect to encounter those who waste your time, loss of time. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. The Romans, as an occupying power, used to compel citizens to carry their baggage. If a citizen felt the touch of a Roman spear on his shoulder, he knew he was about to be compelled to carry baggage for a Roman mile. Roman mile is about 1,000 paces, just slightly less than our mile. And it was a form of service which was obviously regarded as unreasonable and hateful. And then expect to encounter those who are takers, loss of money. Give, Jesus says, to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. At the prayer breakfast on Tuesday, which was for people who work in the city, I saw a friend of mine there, and at the time came to pray for people. I asked him what he wanted to pray for, and he mentioned one of the two things about his work situation. And then he said, oh, and the usual, difficult people. So I said, it's very interesting that you should say that because I'm talking about that on Sunday. Tell me more about what do you mean by difficult people? He said, well, people who don't listen and therefore waste your time. He said, people who are rude. And they said, money. People who take more than their fair share. Oh, isn't it interesting? Those are exactly the categories that Jesus identifies in this passage. Little's changed in 2,000 years. So how do we respond to difficult people? Here's the next heading. Rise above taking revenge. Alfred Hitchcock said this, revenge is sweet and not fattening. I remember years ago seeing a BBC program, Kilroy. Robert Kilroy's Silk used to do these studio audiences. And this particular program was about revenge. And he asked the studio audience, should we take revenge? And I wrote down some of the answers. Most certainly. I cannot allow him to get away with it. You feel a lot better when you've done it. You get satisfaction in your heart if you hurt them as they hurt you. I'll shoot him so he doesn't do what he's done to me to someone else. Revenge can do you good. If you don't take revenge, you lose your self-respect. And each time one of the participants described the actions they'd taken to get revenge, there was a round of applause and cheers from all the others. And many of the replies were understandable. One had suffered sexual abuse, another a loss of a limb through a medical error, another husband who'd had an affair with her sister. And then there was one West Indian woman, and she had a radiant expression. And when Robert Kilroy Silk asked her, should we forgive? She replied, absolutely. My forgiving released me to get on with my life. You forgive and you get the healing because that causes you to be a better person. And she said how she'd been living with a man and expecting his child. Her partner went off on holiday, met another woman. Shortly afterwards, he came back one day and said, I'm married. She said it took 3 weeks to sink in, and then the rage came. she started to plot. She went into the kitchen, she took a hammer, put it in a carrier bag, said, I wanted to hammer his head in. I wanted to scar him in a way that he would always be reminded when he looked in the mirror, he'd think, this is because of what I did to Mary. Kilroy asked, what stopped you? She replied, I became a Christian, and I was told I had to forgive. She shone like a beacon of light on that program. She urged others to forgive, help others in similar situations rather than harboring bitterness. One man said to her, this world's not the way you preach. There are not too many like you around. To which Kilroy replied and ended the program by saying, perhaps there ought to be more. And every time someone becomes a Christian, there should be one more. I told you a couple of weeks ago about Pete Dobbs, who was on the last Alpha course. Former football hooligan, member of the National Front, man of violence, spent time in prison, and he spoke of the difference that Jesus had made in his life. And recently he said this, describing an incident before he was a Christian. He said, once, when I was on my bike, a guy cut me up along the Blackwell Tunnel. I got up off my bike, walked round to where he was stuck in traffic. I put my fist straight through his window. I punched him several times in the face. Then I took his car keys, jumped back on my bike, and rode off with his keys and left him there. A few months ago, he became a Christian. About 3 weeks ago, a car ran over his motorbike. He was in the house, but he heard crunch, crunch, crunch. He said, so I went out to the car, and this little bloke was shaking. He said, before becoming a Christian, I would have dragged him out of the car and battered him. This time I said, are you all right, mate? Look, sit down, don't worry about it. He went, it's your bike. I said, well, it's only a bike. What's a bike? Don't worry about it. He rose above taking revenge. Jesus starts this passage by quoting from the Old Testament. You've heard it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Is he contradicting that now? Well, let's look at the Old Testament law. There were 4 qualifications that we find within the Old Testament itself. First of all, this law, which is there in the Old Testament, was a law of mercy. It was restrictive rather than permissive. In other words, it limits the penalty. The penalty must fit the crime. And it was designed to prevent exactly the kind of thing that we're seeing in Kenya right now. Escalating revenge. And these feuds were characteristic of early society. One member of a tribe was injured by a member of another tribe. All the members of the offended tribe would take revenge on all the members of the offending tribe. And this law was intended to rule out such vendettas. Instead, there was to be an exact correspondence and an exact compensation. Second thing about this Old Testament law is it was created for judges, not for private individuals. So the context, for example, in Deuteronomy 19 is the judges must make a thorough investigation, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So it was a guide for judges in sentencing, an exact correspondent, never intended that individuals should take revenge. Thirdly, it was almost certainly never taken literally, except in the case of capital offences. Penalties were generally replaced by financial fines and damages. Actually, it's very similar to our own legal system. Damages for injury, pain and suffering, medical expenses, loss of wages. And then this was not the whole picture, even as far as the Old Testament was concerned. You get other verses in the Old Testament which say, for example, in Leviticus 19, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge. Love your neighbor as yourself. Proverbs 24, do not say, I'll do to them as they've done to me. I'll pay them back for what they did. And even this, in Lamentations 3:20, let them offer their cheeks to the one who would strike them. So from the very beginning, it was God's will that no human being should take revenge. But what had happened in the time of Jesus, this Old Testament law had been manipulated, used to justify personal vendettas, vengeance, malice, hatred. Jesus is not, therefore, contradicting the Old Testament, but he's repudiating the misinterpretation, the misapplication of the Old Testament. And he's forbidding, therefore, revenge. And he gives 4 concrete examples of non-retaliation. We're not to get even, nor are we to passively stand by. There's nothing passive about any of Jesus' illustrations. We're to act in a way that changes the dynamic of the encounter. We're not to reply like for like, not to adopt the style of the opponent. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. That's not surrender. That is active engagement. Take charge, take the initiative, overcome evil with good. Verse 14, not just let him sue you, take the initiative. Give him your cloak as well. Verse 41, go 2 miles. Turn the tables. The oppressor can only force you to go 1 mile. Go the other one as a volunteer to show that you're not under his orders. Change the dynamics. Now this takes courage. As John Stott writes about this passage, we're not supposed to be a doormat, rather a strong person whose control of themselves and love for others are so powerful that they reject absolutely every conceivable form of retaliation. This, of course, is what Jesus did. When Jesus was abused, assaulted, what strength, what extraordinary self-control. When he was tortured, crucified. And Martin Luther King was, of course, a follower of Jesus, the leader of the mass civil rights movement in the US from the mid-1950s until his death by assassination. He did more than anyone to break the segregation laws. Dr. Benjamin Mays listed his unjust sufferings at his funeral. If any man knew the meaning of suffering, King knew. House-bombed, living day by day for 13 years under constant threats of death, maliciously accused of being a communist, falsely accused of being insincere, stabbed by a member of his own race, jailed over 20 times, occasionally deeply hurt because friends betrayed him. And yet this man had no bitterness in his heart, no rancor in his soul, no revenge in his mind. And he went up and down the length and breadth of the world preaching non-violence and the redemptive power of love. Martin Luther King said this, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. We never get rid of an enemy by meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity. By its very nature, hate destroys and tears down. By its very nature, love creates and builds up. Love transforms with redemptive power. And just before he died, he said this, to our most bitter opponents, we say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We shall meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you. We cannot, in all good conscience, obey your unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. Throw us in jail, and we'll still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our community at the midnight hour and beat us and leave us half dead, and we'll still love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And one day we shall win our freedom. But not only for ourselves, we shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process. And our victory will be a double victory. Third main heading. Act with an attitude of radical love. The illustrations which Jesus gives are all illustrations of the law of love. And we have to interpret Jesus' teaching in the context of everything else that Jesus did and said, and also in the context of the rest of the New Testament. And Jesus himself, you remember, on one occasion, he took a whip of cords and drove out the money changers from the temple. He overturned their tables and ordered them out. And he stood up to the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees. And on occasion, he verbally assaulted them. He demanded an explanation when struck by the official of the high priest. Paul refused to allow the authorities at Philippi to get away with beating him and Silas illegally. He appealed to his right as a Roman citizen not to be flogged without a guilty verdict against him. And in his teaching, Paul makes a very clear distinction between the dealings of the state and personal morality. This is so important that we grasp this. He says, look, as far as the state is concerned, the governing authorities are established by God. So Romans 13, he says, for the one in authority is God's servant to do you good. And if you do wrong, be afraid. For they do not bear the sword for nothing. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So, is Paul contradicting Jesus? No, because a few verses earlier in Romans chapter 12, as far as our personal, individual lives are concerned, do not repay anyone evil for evil, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. The principle of love lies behind both. The state is concerned with the protection of other people. To stand by and allow murder or violence would be unloving and unchristian. By analogy, if it's right for the state to use force to protect its citizens from internal threats, is it not equally right to use force to protect its citizens from external threats? Great theologian Thomas Aquinas said this: just as they use the sword in lawful defense against domestic disturbance when they punish criminals, so they lawfully use the sword of war to protect them from foreign attacks. Our duty as a citizen may involve us in the use of force to restrain evil people. A Christian soldier, for example, may need to kill in the course of his duty. A Christian police officer may be required to use force in performing his duty. A Christian judge may be required to send people to prison. All of us, as Christian citizens, may be required to use force to restrain evil and to protect others. If we see a child being attacked and bullied and abused, we're not supposed to stand idly by. The principle of love requires us to interfere with force, if necessary. So there's bound to be a tension within all of us, because we're individuals and we're citizens of the state. We're all individuals with a command from Jesus not to retaliate or take revenge. On the other hand, we're citizens of the state with a duty to prevent crime, to stop burglars, not to allow rape or murder, and bring wrongdoers to justice. So if we're the victim of a crime, of course we should forgive the criminal and not seek revenge. Yet, we should do everything in our power, first of all, to stop the crime, and then to bring that person, the perpetrator of the crime, to justice. This is not easy to hold this tension. It's really hard. But the attitude of love requires that we do. The same applies to civil wrongs perpetrated against us. It's not wrong to go to court, provided that the motive is love and justice, not retaliation or revenge. Likewise, an evil or oppressive employer may need stopping in their tracks. If someone asks us for money on the streets, and we believe that they're going to use that money to abuse their body through drugs or alcohol, then it's not necessarily loving to give them that money. Probably better to buy them food or invite them to our new night shelter, homeless shelter. In every situation, we need to act with this attitude of strong love. It's important that we don't overqualify this. We need to feel the challenge of Jesus' words, not allow his words to die the death of 1,000 qualifications. He calls us to totally disregard our own rights and at the same time be totally passionate about the rights of others. And we're called to a totally different lifestyle to the world around us. We're called to be salt and light. Someone said this: to return evil for good is devilish. To return good for good, that's human. To return good for evil, that's divine. That's what Jesus did. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this about Jesus: it looked as though evil had triumphed on the cross, but the real victory belonged to Jesus. The cross is the only power in the world which proves that suffering love can avenge and vanquish evil. On the 9th of June, 1972, a photo appeared on the front page of the Washington Post. A young girl running towards the camera, her arms outstretched, her clothes burnt off, her skin blackened by napalm, screaming in pain. The girl's name is Kim Phuc, which means golden happiness. After 14 months in hospital, 17 operations, she returned home worried that her wounds were so ugly that no one would ever want to marry her. Nick Ut's photo won the Pulitzer Prize and became an emblem for an entire nation questioning its reason for being in Vietnam. Some years later, she read the New Testament in a local library, and she became a Christian. She said this: it was the fire of the bomb that burnt my body. It was the skill of the doctor that mended my skin. But it took the power of God to heal my heart. She resumed her medical studies in 1986, 14 years after the bomb. And her burns still required daily washing and medication. A fellow Vietnamese student named Tuan offered to carry the necessary buckets of water up to her apartment. And it wasn't long before he was touched by the loveliness of Kim's spirit. And they were married in 1992, and they managed to defect to Canada. In 1996, Kim agreed to speak at a Veterans Day ceremony held in Washington, D.C., and she took her place on the rostrum, flanked by U.S. military dignitaries before a huge crowd of veterans. She stood before a sea of uniforms. It must have been a terrifying sight for her, bringing back the memories of the war. And she said this: I have suffered a lot from both physical and emotional pain. Sometimes I thought I could not live, but God saved my life, and he gave me faith and hope. And then she uttered healing words of grace and forgiveness. She said, even if I could talk face to face with the pilot who dropped the bomb, I could tell him, we can't change history, but we can try to do good things for the present and for the future, to promote peace. When she'd finished her brief but moving remarks, the veterans rose to their feet. They broke into an explosion of applause, many of them in tears. It's important to us that she's here, one veteran said. For her to forgive us personally means something. One man was overcome with emotion. He rushed to the patrolman and scribbled out a note, asking him to deliver it to Kim. I'm the man you're looking for, the note read. Intermediaries asked if she was willing to see him, and she said yes, if they could arrange a meeting away from the crush of people. Officials brought the man over to her car, and when the reporters cleared away, Kim turned and looked straight into the man's eyes, and then held out her arms. Same arms that she held out as she ran along that road in agony from her burning skin. And she hugged the man, and he began to sob. I'm so sorry. I am just so sorry. She replied, it's okay. I forgive. I forgive. Echoing her favorite Bible verse, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Forgive and you will be forgiven. That day, the famous photo of 30 years ago of the terrified little Vietnamese girl fleeing the napalm flames was replaced in the national consciousness by this image of a young mother embracing a GI, an ex-GI. The words of forgiveness that Kim extended that Veterans Day helped heal the consciences of thousands of veterans gathered there. And as news reports carried the story far and wide, her words and the striking image helped heal the nation's wounds as well. May we pray. Lord, we want to thank you today for the power of the words of Jesus to transform our lives, our families, our workplaces, our neighborhoods, our city, our world. And Lord, we pray, because without you we cannot do this. We pray that you would fill each one of us with your Spirit tonight, with your love. Help us to live the kind of life that really is salt and light in our society, that breaks the cycle of revenge and retaliation and brings instead the love and the peace of Christ for his glory. Amen.